Moving day smelled like cardboard and cut grass. The garage was a maze of labeled boxes, the living room a scatter of furniture feet wrapped in blue pads. On the curb, the little ceramic gnome I had unpacked first stood where I imagined he'd live for years, right by the mailbox, grinning foolishly into the newness of everything. That's when the warning showed up, not as a letter tucked under the door or polite welcome with a list of neighborhood guidelines, but as a man with a clipboard who regarded my mailbox like a crime scene. He wasn't introduced. He didn't need to be. The body language said it all, the touch of authority, the practiced stare, the way he scanned hedges and gutters like a building inspector with a stopwatch. The title would come later, embossed on stationery and whispered by neighbors. For that moment, I only knew that he moved like he owned the block. He was exactly the kind of person you imagine when you hear the phrase neighborhood committee. The shoes were the first clue, polished to the point that the sun bounced off them, and next came the pen clipped to the slot of his shirt pocket, the kind of pen that leaves a permanent groove on forms and carries ink like a gavel. He didn't ask how the move was going or whether I needed the name of a trustworthy plumber. He did what he did with every newcomer. I would learn. He treated the front lawn like a courtroom and the curb like the witness stand. The verdict came fast and final. The gnome was out of order, the mailbox ornament non-compliant, the lawn an introduction to a list I hadn't yet seen. I told myself the neighborhood probably had standards for a reason. A place with crime rates low enough to be a selling point must run on some machine of order humming just beneath the surface. Maybe he kept it that way. Maybe the clipboard was a symbol of care, even if the delivery felt like a slap on the wrist. In that early hour of being new, it was easy to swallow the benefit of the doubt. Everyone has roles, I thought. Some people bake welcome cookies. Some people measure grass. And sometimes they happen to be the same person wearing different hats. Except I was learning there was only one hat, and it fit too tightly. The neighborhood seemed pleasant enough if you didn't look too closely. Cul-de-sacs stitched together with identical lampposts, mailboxes in soldierly rows, street names themed after trees that had never grown on this soil. Cars passed slowly, drivers raising 2 fingers off the steering wheel in that polite suburb nod. Behind it all, a current ran, half whisper, half routine. Garage doors lowered quickly as if to hide something, and front yards, though immaculate, felt like stages waiting for the curtain to drop. The curtain, as it turned out, was an email, and the stage manager had a name, Greg Thompson, president of the Homeowners Association. His name arrived the way a storm forecast arrives, through a chain of neighbors trading cautionary tales not as gossip but as survival tips. He had lists, they said. He had a measuring tape cut to standards he claimed were in the bylaws. He liked to walk at the hour when work-from-home calls were in full swing and stay-at-home parents were herding toddlers in from scooters. He would note, click his pen, and keep moving. The little ceramic gnome I'd placed by the mailbox became my introduction to the silent playbook. That ridiculous, cheerful statue started feeling less like a decoration and more like a dare. The next morning, a folded notice appeared under my doormat. The notice wasn't written with the warmth of a welcome packet. It had the stiff tone of a parking ticket, with bolded sections and numbered clauses arranged to remind me that feelings were irrelevant here. My lawn ornament violated section something or other, a rule about visible objects not on the pre-approved list. There was also a cheery solution paragraph offering to submit requests to the design committee. My mind, still clinging to optimism, pictured a group of neighbors gathered around swatches, discussing tasteful options. That illusion lasted until I checked the signature line. The committee was a committee of one. The gnome went into the garage for a timeout. I told myself it was temporary, just until I learned the ropes. Settling in required energy for furniture and paint, for figuring out where the good coffee was and which supermarket produce section didn't feel like a warehouse. The neighborhood wanted conformity, I thought, and maybe that wasn't the worst price to pay for clean sidewalks and a pool with summer hours. It could be like joining a gym. Show up, follow the rules, enjoy the benefits. But the gnome wasn't really the point. The point was the way every glance from my front door felt like an inspection. The more I unpacked, the more I noticed him. Greg on his patrols, clipboard at angles that suggested judgment rather than notes. He didn't look for trash. He looked for deviation. He didn't consider context. He checked boxes. The neighbors behaved accordingly. Hedges were trimmed like military haircuts. Wind chimes were noticeably absent. Front porch chairs never multiplied without visible intent. Even the kids' sidewalk chalk stayed inside the invisible margins. It wasn't order so much as choreography, one neighbor at a time trying not to catch the eye of the man who directed the show. For a while, I complied the way everyone did. Boxes left the garage, and the gnome stayed behind a stack of paint cans, banished in exchange for peace. The lawn grew inch by permitted inch. Each day, I waved at dog walkers and learned names in that careful way of newcomers who don't want to step wrong. Then, as the days piled into weeks, the notices started arriving with a rhythm of junk mail. The tone of my home shifted from newly decorated to newly surveilled. The cautionary tale from neighbors grew into evidence. It wasn't just me. It was all of us. The warning sign had never really been the gnome. It had been the clipboard, the pen, the posture, and the confidence of someone who believed the title on his stationery was a crown. The neighborhood was neat because people were scared. The silence on the sidewalks wasn't serenity. It was compliance. By the time I realized it, the pattern was clear. The man with the clipboard wasn't motivated by pride in the community. He was hooked on control. And control is an appetite that grows with each surrendered inch. By the end of that first month, I had memorized the shape of his shadow on my driveway. The boxes were unpacked. The house felt like mine on the inside. Outside, it felt like paper-thin ownership, a rental from compliance. The gnome's grin, peeking from the top of a storage bin, started to look less silly and more symbolic. The stage was set. The next act would not be gentle. The first chapter of any story about a neighborhood tyrant rarely ends with a dramatic showdown. It ends with a dozen small cuts that begin to sting in unison. I didn't know it then, but the stack of notices on my kitchen counter had already started to harden into resolve, and the garage, home to a boxed-up gnome, had quietly become a war room. The curtain hovered. The next scene was inevitable. The paper trail blossomed like an invasive vine. The envelopes carried his name, and the tone never softened. The first month produced 5 violations, each one a lesson in how power disguises itself as procedure. The trash can have been visible from the street for a total of 6 minutes after collection, and a camera timestamp from my doorbell confirmed it. The letter didn't care. The rule, as he typed it, was as rigid as fencing wire. The dent in my back bumper merited a warning, because parked vehicles were part of the neighborhood's aesthetic promise. Even the flowers I planted, cheerful survivors from a clearance table, didn't make the cut. They weren't one of the 3 approved colors. An oddly specific palette I later learned was a result of a years-old memo Greg had written and circulated until people assumed it was law. It wasn't just me. The tail stacked in other driveways, too. Susan next door got clipped for leaving her Christmas lights up until January 2nd, as though the calendar reset at midnight and mercy expired with it. The family down the street, the ones with a basketball hoop, received a 3-page letter pack with underlines explaining how their hoop obstructed the aesthetic flow of the cul-de-sac. A dad rolled the hoop into their backyard, defeated. The kids retreated to video games. More than once, I saw the hoop peeking from behind a fence like a grounded teenager. New rules appeared with a cadence you could set your watch by. Greg loved the phrase must remain and built sentences around it the way some people build birdhouses. Garage doors must remain closed unless in active use. Grass must remain at or under 2.5 inches in height. Outdoor furniture must remain approved by the design committee, a panel that nobody could identify because it was as real as a cardboard storefront. The committee was Greg. Greg was a committee. He wore both as a costume and rarely broke character. The neighborhood communication channels, emails and a dry forum with an ancient layout, were curated like museum exhibits. Requests for clarity were answered with citations to sections that didn't exist, which were then attached to new documents that did. The bylaws as filed with the county were one thing. The living rules as enforced by the man with a clipboard were quite another. Conflating the two was a trick. People worked busy jobs and tended to kids, and nobody had the appetite to untangle legalese at 10 at night. It was easier to drag the trash can behind a bush and keep the garage shut like a secret. Easier not to ask why on earth blanket bans existed for garden colors, as if hydrangeas were a threat. I began to archive everything. Whatever else I didn't know how to do, I could document. Each violation notice went into a folder with subfolders by topic: trash, car, landscaping, miscellaneous. I noted dates and took photos. It felt paranoid at first, the way you feel when you start recording serial numbers of appliances. But the pattern emerged with the clarity of a graph. Weekend prime for patrols, early morning rounds on recycling day, an uptick in new rules after any board meeting where someone questioned him. The HOA wasn't an institution here. It was a personality. Neighbors told their stories in low voices, like conspiracy theories that are just ordinary truths spoken at an unflattering volume. One retired couple had received a $50 fine for leaving a stepladder in view while cleaning their gutters. Another resident patched a fence board the wrong shade of brown and got a formal warning about color continuity. It turned routine chores into a game of hide-and-seek with arbitrary precedents. People joked about Greg carrying a ruler in his sock. The laughter had an edge. In a normal neighborhood, violations might spur friendly reminders and eyeball-level conversations. Hey, everything arrived in writing because writing could be waved like a flag. The letters used favorite words. Immediate, non-compliant, subject to, recurrence. They carried deadlines and the subtle suggestion that ignoring them might snowball into something expensive. When I saw them, I felt a strange admixture of resentment and fatigue. Time spent appealing would be time surrendered to the very thing I disliked. Time paying a small fine would be the fast way out and the tacit endorsement of the system. The trap was elegant. The trap relied on people choosing convenience over confrontation. In the evenings, the streets glowed with those warm chandelier windows that sell houses and brochures. But under the glow, everyone had adjusted their habits. Amazon packages vanished from porches at a speed that suggested choreography, not just caution. Garden hoses were coiled like snakes at attention. Even holiday decorations were risk-calculated decisions. It stole harmless pleasures and replaced them with a constant hum, a what-if chorus that played at the back of the mind. What if the dog leash left on the porch counted as clutter? What if the chalk drawing became graffiti in the wrong eye? What if the wrong wreath color invited a fine? I stopped thinking of Greg as a neighbor and started thinking of him as a function. He was a set of eyes coupled to a desire for rule-proving. He seemed to draw energy from the act of enforcement, as if every notice fueled the next round of patrols. He was precise in the way people are when they collect stamps or track steps, except the collection here was other people's compliance. The folder on my desktop grew. So did the quiet anger. Not just at the content of the rules, although plenty of them read like performance art, but at the structural fact that one person had effectively replaced consensus with fiat. Compliance looked like harmony from far away. Up close, it was demoralization. A park without laughter is still a park. A neighborhood without agency is still a neighborhood. It's just one that forgets how to breathe. The day I found the notice about the bench I was building, I was only halfway into the project. Pine boards lined up on sore horses like a promise. It became clear that the absurdity was not leveling off. Outdoor construction projects must be pre-approved. The letter announced. It was impossible to read it without imagining a council hearing about a porch bench. My sense of humor helped for about 30 seconds. Then it changed into something else. The bench would have supported 2 people and a cup of coffee. It was a simple thing. Somehow, the system had made even that feel suspicious. Rules, when they protect shared spaces, are often invisible because they help things function smoothly. You barely notice the speed limit sign that keeps a street safe for bikes. But rules designed for control announce themselves. They show up like impatient guests. They talk over everything. And after a while, without anyone consenting aloud, they start to feel normal. By that point, what you need isn't a clever workaround or one more hidden trash can corner. What you need is a pivot. The bench sat unfinished for days, and the gnome, still sequestered in the garage, acquired the kind of symbolic weight objects earned by accident. Both belonged outside in a neighborhood where people could exhale. Both were, at the moment, proof that one man's handwritten memos had become the weather. The season was due to change, whether the forecast said so or not. The second chapter of this story wasn't really about letters and measurements. It was about the slow boil of a community that had gotten used to lowering the flame on itself to avoid attention. A shift was coming, and it wouldn't be initiated by another notice. It would begin with whispered conversations on sidewalks, a spreadsheet of signatures, and the rediscovery of something stronger than a clipboard. The breaking point didn't crash like a cymbal. It crept in, small and insistent, the way a splinter refuses to be ignored once the skin around it reddens. The day was bright enough that sawdust glowed when it hit the driveway, and the pine boards, sanded smooth, waited for Stain. That simple bench had a strangely ceremonial quality now. I could feel the eyes of the street even when blinds stayed shut. Nothing dramatic happened at first. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouted declaration that the bench was a threat. There didn't need to be. Another printed notice showed up, crisp and impersonal, referencing a clause that most likely lived only in Greg's archive, and the message threaded through each line was the same as always. Stop. Stopping would have been easy. Drag the boards into the garage, lock the door, pour coffee inside instead of out. The routine had become muscle memory. But muscle memory can be retrained. The thought of folding again created an unfamiliar weight in my chest, something between shame and impatience. I wasn't building a gazebo. I was assembling a place to sit. The difference between those two realities, the benign simplicity of the bench and the bureaucratic fuss it had attracted, was a final ounce of scale needed. I started with small conversations, careful and plain, not whispers meant for drama, just the ordinary exchange of neighbors who had learned to look both ways before stepping into their own front yards. Susan, who had tolerated the Christmas light shame notice with a shrug that didn't reach her eyes, had a folder too. It was thick. The basketball family had learned all the synonyms for aesthetic from 3 months of letters. People who had barely waved before now lingered at the curb with that sheepish relief humans carry when they realize they aren't crazy alone. The stories aligned like coordinates. The problem wasn't taste. It wasn't lawn care zealotry. It was a concentration of power in one man's hands and a shared willingness to see ground because we had assumed the ground belonged to him. Once the realization moved from gut to brain, action followed almost automatically. The HOA bylaws weren't a secret, despite how mythical they'd begun to feel. They lived in a binder and on a dusty PDF file, accessible to any homeowner who could carve out an hour and a tolerance for legal paragraphs. Reading them wasn't thrilling, but it produced electricity. The document, unlike Greg's letters, had been drafted to govern a community, not to feed a personality. In clear language, it spelled out mechanisms for change. Presidents did not reign. They served. They could be recalled by petition in a special meeting, a fact that felt at once obvious and revolutionary because it had been so successfully obscured by newsletters written in the key of inevitability. The plan was simple enough to fit on an index card. Collect signatures from a percentage of homeowners, request a special meeting, bring it to a vote. The execution, however, needed something stronger than indignation. It needed coordination and a willingness to risk the discomfort of being seen resisting. Greg's power had grown precisely because most of his targets preferred invisibility to confrontation. The petition would ruin invisibility. It would require knocking on doors, explaining calmly what had been whispered angrily, and documenting the desire for a different style of governance. It would also require the one thing he hadn't been prepared for, togetherness. We started with a handful of households in a spreadsheet, avoiding the trap of anonymity by agreeing to be open and factual. The stories stood on their own. Photos of warning letters, timestamps, emails with shifting rules, all of it formed a mosaic of overreach. But anger wasn't our selling point. People are more likely to move for something than against something, even when the move begins in protest. So the message was straightforward. This was an opportunity to reset, to build a board that represented the neighborhood as a whole, to clarify rules grounded in the original bylaws, and to return to the purpose of an HOA, which is stewardship rather than surveillance. The door-knocking felt like both campaign and therapy. It was remarkable how quickly hesitance melted when homeowners realized their experiences were common. One by one, the signatures appeared on the petition with a pen decisive enough to feel like reclaiming real estate. Some people hesitated, not because they disagreed, but because they feared reprisal. That fear was the most damning evidence we collected without even trying. A neighborhood should not feel like a place where political risk is attached to garden ornaments. We addressed it with practicalities, assuring them petition process was built into the bylaws, that fair vote protected participants, that the board could not fine people for exercising governance, but the deeper reassurance came from numbers. Every new signature was one less household alone. Over a few weeks, our quiet map of support expanded. Odd conversations bloomed. Retirement delayed a week because someone wanted to be present for the vote. Babysitters arranged so entire families could attend. The basketball family began tentatively rolling their hoop out on Saturday mornings again, almost like testing the strength of a bridge. It turned out that the bridge was us. I anticipated a showdown at the request stage. Instead, The board secretary, a real person with a real sense of duty who had mostly been sidelined by Greg's appetite for control, responded promptly and neutrally. A special meeting was scheduled according to procedure. The community room was booked. Notices went out, this time with a plain voice of official process, and the agenda was set. Unlike the mini-courts Greg had run out of his email drafts, this would have a clock and a vote. The word recall looked heavy on the paper but lighter on the tongue each time someone said it without flinching. In the days leading up to the meeting, Greg's patrols intensified. He posted reminders about compliance on the forum, leaning hard on his familiar vocabulary. A few more notices showed up around the neighborhood like flares. If his intention was to reassert control, the effect was the opposite. Every extra fine was a recruiting poster for our petition. People who had been on the fence found themselves studying their mailboxes for envelopes they dreaded. It was extraordinary how quickly a community can harden into clarity when pressure reaches a particular threshold. Fear froze people. Too much fear cracked the ice. When the evening arrived, the community room took on the nervous energy of a school gym on election night. Folding chairs lined up in tight rows. Coffee urns bubbled with donations from residents who couldn't bake cookies but could buy paper cups. The board table looked ceremonial, a place where gorgeously boring decisions should be made about paving schedules and pool hours. For once, it would host a decision with moral weight. What happened that didn't involve speeches designed to go viral or grandstanding to score points? It was quiet, procedural, and devastatingly clear. The bylaws were read. The motion was made. The vote was cast by secret ballot. Tallying unfolded with the quiet gravity of people counting more than slips of paper. They were counting permission. When the result landed, it landed like a storm passing. The room exhaled. The president's tenure ended in a few syllables, just as it had ruled by a few lines of text. The symmetry felt just. There was no triumphal music. There were hugs and a handful of relieved tears in corners, and there was, in the center of the room, a clipboard finally set down like an object that had outlived its use. Control had been mistaken for order for too long. Now order would have a chance to be something gentler. The breaking point ends not with broken people, but with a neighborhood ready to discover its voice again. The next chapter would test whether that voice could hold steady once the adrenaline wore off. The morning after the vote felt strangely ordinary. Garbage trucks still clanged through the block. Sprinklers still clicked on at dawn. The sameness fooled the eye, but something was different in the posture of front porches. People waved a fraction more generously. Children biked down the sidewalk without parents hovering like referees. That was the surface. Underneath, the real work began. A recall was a correction, not a cure. The new board still needed to be seated. Paperwork still needed signatures. The bank still required updated officers to access the HOA account. 4 years. The process had been a one-man show held together by bluster and a few enablers who preferred not to read the fine print. Now we had to build a routine that didn't depend on a single person's appetite. It was humbling and refreshing to watch responsibilities spread across people's calendars. The board secretary became visible as a steady anchor. A treasurer stepped forward who spoke spreadsheet as a first language. The design review, which now meant something different than one person's taste, became a team that treated the neighborhood like a collaboration rather than a canvas for punishment. The first act of the new board was symbolic on purpose. They paused enforcement letters while rules were audited, then published the actual bylaws with human-readable notes. The effect was immediate. The email list, once a platform for Greg's edicts, turned into a bulletin of genuine information. It explained how to request changes, what required approval and what never should have in the first place, and where the HOA's authority ended. People smiled reading a neighborhood update for the first time in memory. You could feel stress drop like a barometer before a pleasant weather front. Greg didn't evaporate. He was still a homeowner, still a presence, still the owner of a pair of shoes that shone like a day. In the weeks after the recall, he walked with wounded dignity, not quite patrolling but never fully retiring the posture. He occasionally printed his own notices with the old letterhead he hadn't returned yet, dropping them like ghosts on selected porches. They were legal nullities now, easily ignored, but they still unsettled at first. It took a couple of neighborhood-wide messages from the board, clear and calm, to make the point that enforcement authority wasn't a personality trait you could carry around after losing it. Where there's loosened control, there's always a fear of swing-back chaos. It didn't happen. Lawns didn't grow into savannas. Christmas lights didn't stay up until Easter. The basketball hoops returned to the cul-de-sac felt like a reunion with a friend, not a revolution. Even the gnome's reappearance by my mailbox, wiped of garage dust and set with a small flourish, looked less like defiance and more like balance returning. People began planting flowers in the spectrum beyond the old palette, and the world did not end. We discovered another cost of the old regime, deferred maintenance. Real board tasks had been starved of attention in favor of theatrical fines. Fences needed staining plans. Sidewalks had sections that lifted and could trip small feet. The pool pump, a veteran past its prime, demanded a replacement schedule. The new board faced decisions with actual consequences and responded with something novel, open meetings. Neighbors came. They asked practical questions. They disagreed on details and agreed on priorities without turning everything into a referendum on personal taste. In an odd way, the monotony of good governance was thrilling. Adult lives are in short supply of constructive monotony. Not everything smoothed out instantly. Greg found new venues. He filed a complaint with the city about a supposed zoning issue related to someone shed a last-ditch attempt to use a larger authority to enforce his sense of order. The city inspector came, took a look, read the actual code, and left with a shrug. It was a reminder that lines exist for a reason, and that power borrowed without consent is brittle. He also floated rumors that the recall had been rigged, which died quickly in the light of numbers and process. The neighborhood learned to metabolize his provocations as static rather than signal. Trust slowly returned to the sidewalks. Kids chalked again. A community book exchange appeared, a little free library someone erected beside a flowering shrub. The design committee approved it within a day with a note that made everyone grin. Common sense exercised. A Saturday morning coffee circle grew on a rotating basis at different driveways. Nobody needed permission to stand on concrete and sip caffeine, but after years of watching people hide normalcy, it felt like registering a win. The quietest change happened in the realm of fear. If a neighbor forgot a trash bin by the curb for an hour, nobody's day was ruined. If a windstorm blew a wreath slightly off-center, nobody drafted a letter. The neighborhood had been a place where small mistakes expanded under a magnifying glass. Now it was a place where they shrank into their appropriate size. That shift is hard to quantify, but it might be the entire point of living near people in the first place, the mutual agreement to let life be a little messy. I kept the bench on the porch as planned. It took staying beautifully and, more important, it took the weight of two people in a morning ritual that tasted like relief. Neighbors sat on it, two, one at a time, letting conversation spin easy. The bench's existence, once deemed suspicious, turned into a proof that the world kept turning without paperwork for minor decency. There were bumps. A letter went out clarifying that certain structural changes still required approval, which was as it should be. Someone painted a house trim color that glowed a bit too aggressively in late afternoon, and the committee worked with them to tone it down without shame. It was oddly satisfying to watch a real process handle a real issue without turning into spectacle. Adults behaving like adults, underrated content. Greg remained. He wasn't a villain in a movie vanishing after defeat. He was a neighbor with a habit that no longer had an outlet. Sometimes he glared. Sometimes he pretended not to notice gatherings he once would have policed. People, being people, didn't erase him from their social maps, but they did shrink his importance to size. He became a man with a clipboard that stayed mostly at home. The neighborhood had struck back not with pitchforks but with paperwork and patience. The culmination was not applause but the drip of ordinary days that no longer needed to defend themselves. The next chapter would be about what thrives when a community stops spending its energy on dodging foolishness and starts spending it on building something it actually wants. After the frenzy of organizing and voting, the aftermath arrived like a long exhale. Sometimes change looks like headlines. Sometimes it looks like Saturday morning. In our case, it looked like both. The bulletin board by the pool, once covered in stern reminders and clipped subclauses, now featured a calendar of actual events. A neighborhood yard sale, a volunteer mulch day, a movie night projected onto someone's garage door. The absence of constant policing created space, and space invited creativity. The new board faced a backlog that revealed the distortions of the past. Vendor contracts needed review. Insurance policies had been renewed by Nature. The landscaping schedule had been optimistically designed for an imaginary climate where grass stopped growing on cue. The board divided responsibilities and invited subject matter volunteers to weigh in. An engineer on the block assessed sidewalk issues. A retired accountant untangled budget line items. All of it had a homemade flavor that felt right, like a potluck where someone brings dessert you didn't know you were craving. Compliance didn't vanish. It matured. Real rules, trash bins to keep vermin down, architectural consistency to protect property values without smothering individuality, noise guidelines to keep nights restful, made sense. They were explained, enforced sparingly, and accompanied by grace periods and actual conversations. The forum stopped reading like a litany of sins and started sounding like a shared calendar. People used names again instead of hiding behind lot numbers. That small change, name instead of unit, restored humanity to interactions that had previously felt like disputes at a DMV window. Greg's presence lingered like weather that refuses to clear entirely. He tried one more gambit, sending a letter to an old mailing list with some dramatic language about the legitimacy of the vote. It fizzled. The board posted the meeting minutes, vote counts, and the lawyer's confirmation of process in a transparent package that bored even the most curious. Transparency is kryptonite for conspiracy. He filed a small claims complaint about a fine from months past that he himself had issued, and then tried to ratify through the previous board. It was dismissed with the efficiency of a judge who has seen enough homeowner melodramas to recognize when someone is addicted to being the protagonist. I wouldn't pretend there was no residue. People had trained themselves to check over their shoulders. It took real time for that reflex to fade. For a while, I still found myself reading porch scenes the way you read story problems in math class, hunting for the trick. Was the wreath too big? Was the chair angle aggressive? Did the garden hose coil exceed some unwritten radius? Those reflexes softened as new habits replaced them. It's remarkable how resilient ordinary life is when pressure lifts. Laughter returns to sidewalks like birds to trees after thunderclap. The gnome resumed his quiet watch by my mailbox. He gathered neighborhood lore in silence. Passers-by occasionally tapped his hat for luck. Children named him without asking permission. He became not a symbol of defiance, but a souvenir of balance restored, a tiny monument to a simple idea. Homes are for living before they are for displays. There were stories worth savoring in the aftermath. Susan's Christmas lights that had drawn punishment now became a highlight because she coordinated a lighting night where multiple houses switched on at once in December, and the board cheered it on as a community tradition rather than a violation waiting to happen. The basketball hoop returned as part of the daily soundtrack. A neighbor who had been meticulous about lawn height out of fear now relaxed and still kept a neat yard because neatness made him happy, not because a ruler forced him into it. Motivation, it turns out, is visible in the details. The best change might have been the reintroduction of kindness into official communications. A new resident moved in down the block and received a welcome email that included the pool key instructions, the trash pickup days, and a paragraph explaining that decorative items were personal choices within broad common-sense bounds. The message ended with an invitation to reach out if anything felt confusing. That sentence would have been unthinkable in the previous regime, not because kindness was illegal, but because it was irrelevant to the performance of power. None of this made the neighborhood perfect. Disagreements still surfaced. Someone tried to plant a row of invasive species and learned why certain restrictions exist. Music drifted too late from a graduation party and required a friendly nudge. But the energy around conflict changed. The goal was no longer to catch and punish. It was to clarify and move on. That shift produced a different kind of memory. You stop associating your home with the dread of envelopes and start associating it with the smell of jasmine at dusk. Every story needs an emblem, and ours had too, a bench and a gnome. The bench hosted conversations that shouldn't have required permission. The gnome stood happily where he belonged. The presence of both, mundane as they were, signaled that fear had been given proper proportions. The most astonishing revelation of the aftermath was that declining to be afraid is contagious. Once a critical mass of people began living normally in public, the few holdouts either adjusted or looked absurd trying not to. Greg sold his house eventually, but not immediately. He lingered, perhaps hoping for a wave of nostalgia for firm hands and firm letters. It didn't come. When the for sale sign appeared, nobody cheered. They just noted the fact. wished him well in their heads, and went back to pruning roses and inflating pool floats. A new family moved in a month later. Their patio featured mismatched chairs. Nobody measured them. Aftermath can fail if they fix only symptoms. Ours succeeded because it recentered the idea of a neighborhood as a commons, not a stage. We did not swap one petty tyrant for another. We swapped tyranny for process. The result felt unglamorous in all the right ways. The next and final chapter belonged to perspective, to the lesson that remains after the letters stop coming and the bench fade a little in the sun. Time is the only reliable test of change. A season passed, then another. The vines crept and were trimmed with ordinary care. The pool hosted splashing chaos on long afternoons. The HOA budget cycle ran without alarm bells, and the audit came back with a kind of remarks that put you to sleep in a good way. The drama receded not into silence but into the baseline hum of a community working like a community, trading favors, arguing gently about mulch types, and minding business in the generous sense of that phrase. The board institutionalized transparency without turning it into a performance. Meeting agendas went out a week in advance. Minutes were posted without delay. A question about paint colors received a response that pointed to an updated guide anchored in actual bylaws, not personal preference. The design review process transformed into a consultation rather than a gauntlet. People learned that asking for input early saved headaches later, and the committee learned that flexibility was not a synonym for chaos. In other words, everyone relearned how to be adults making decisions together. The culture change filtered into small, invisible places. A neighbor who had quietly hidden a wind chime in the backyard brought it to the front porch and discovered that its gentle sound carried about 6 feet and offended nobody. Another neighbor, who once timed trash can retrievals to the minute like a prisoner-fearing roll call, started taking an afternoon walk that included bringing the bin back when it was convenient. These acts were not rebellions. They were calibrations toward normal. The narrative about Greg settled into the past tense. He became a chapter rather than an ongoing character. When his house sold, the listing photos presented a home indistinguishable from others. Clean lines, stage pillows, the absence of personal quirks that might scare buyers who believe they want a blank slate. The irony didn't slip past us. The ultimate enforcer of sameness left behind a template interior begging for difference. The new owners obliged. They hung art that made their porch look like a conversation with color, the kind of display that would have once drawn a printed notice and now drew curious smiles. We held a full block party as a capstone to the reboot. It wasn't announced as a victory lap because triumph is best expressed through regularity, not banners. There were tables of potluck dishes, name tags next to bowls of chips, a rented bounce house that squeaked pleasantly with each landing. A neighbor played acoustic guitar as if front yard music had been invented that morning. Someone set up projector and played a movie on a sheet clipped to a garage door. The board president, a volunteer with a tendency to listen twice before speaking, mingled without a clipboard because governance does not always need props. The party was memorable for its absence of edge. People didn't scan for enforcers. They scanned for the next person to hand a paper plate piled with fruit. I watched my bench fill and empty, the stain worn to satin by the backs of knees, and I realized that the truest artifact of our neighborhood's transformation was not stored in a file or a court record. It sat right there, taking the weight of whoever needed a seat. Parents cradling sleeping toddlers, teens trading stories in confidence, an elderly neighbor whose cane leaned against the arm for a blessed half-hour. The gnome, ridiculous as ever, weathered into his role. He became a landmark. Kids used him as a base in made-up games. A runner tapped his hat on morning routes as a ritual. New residents got the story in digest form. Once upon a time, a neighbor confused authority with ownership, and the community remembered how to vote. The gnome's grin did not change, but our reaction to it did. It no longer triggered a calculation about risk. It triggered an amused gratitude that something so small could have been such a large mirror. Every community stores a potential for overreach the way every human stores a potential for stubbornness. The trick isn't pretending that potential doesn't exist. The trick is designing routines that prevent it from quietly enlarging into habit. We made small commitments with large effects. Publish rules plainly, require multiple signatures for significant actions, rotate committee roles so no one grows roots in power, schedule casual gatherings so that the only time neighbors meet isn't when they're mad. Structure, when done well, doesn't crush freedom, it carries it. If there's a lesson to tell into a camera for a channel that thrives on the human appetite for property drama, it is this: control often masquerades as care. The test is how it reacts to sunlight. If care is the motive, transparency strengthens it. If control is the motive, transparency dissolves it. In our case, sunlight proved the illegibility of the old way and the durability of the new. The viral part of the story was the recall night, the thrill of collective action. The valuable part was everything after, the boring, beautiful cadence of decisions made in daylight. I kept expecting some final test, a last gasp from the past that would demand another organized response. It never came. The closest thing was a small flurry when someone proposed community garden in a scrappy patch near the pool pump. Half the neighborhood wanted tomatoes. The other half worried about bees. We discussed, measured, compromised, and built a modest set of raised beds with neat borders and a posted schedule. The bees came. The tomatoes flourished, and people who had never spoken to each other found themselves shoulder to shoulder pulling weeds. You cannot write a better epilogue for a neighborhood than that. At dusk one evening, I sat on the bench with a mug cooling in my hands, listening to sprinklers tick and the far-off bounce of basketball. The air had that just right feeling of a place that knows itself again. The mailbox gnome caught a slant of light and looked posed for a postcard, absurd and perfect. I remembered the first day, the clipboard, the chilly language of notices, the way I had shrunk my life to avoid a man's gaze, and then I looked at the street as it was now. The difference was not a miracle. It was a decision repeated 100 times by ordinary people who chose to be neighbors instead of subjects. Stories crave dramatic conclusions, but real life often signs its name softly. The new normal was not a banner waving over a conquered castle. It was a laugh of someone borrowing a ladder without worrying they were breaking a rule. It was a welcome email with information and warmth sharing the same paragraph. It was a gnome that stayed put. It was a knowledge that, if necessary, the community could make noise again, knowing that is sometimes all it takes to keep from needing to. The chapters closed not with a slammed door, but with a hinge that worked smoothly, a fitting that would outlast any single personality. The bench would fade and be restained. The gnome might chip and be glued. Rules would be updated, offices rotated, disagreements handled. The neighborhood would hum, not as a machine of compliance, but as a chorus that knew the tune by heart.